Welcome to Speckle, the only podcast focused on breaking free in the AEC industry through ingenious solutions executed by some very bold individuals. Expect a series of interviews with AEC leaders and innovators where we shed light on their achievements as they navigate the industry. In this episode, we speak with Katherine Chimenes, a structural engineer working at Price & Myers. Katherine is an engineer interested in the possibilities technology presents for sustainability and the built environment. She is a member of Price & Myers' in-house computation group. Constantly pushing for innovative ways of doing things, Katherine delivers projects to a high standard, exploring boundaries to improve building efficiency and reduce environmental impact. Having grown up in Paris and moved to London over a decade ago, she loves how quickly her bike can get her across town to follow her interests in art and live music. Okay, Katherine, welcome to Speckle Pod. I'm very happy to have you with us today.
Hi, Senda.
How are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm doing great and I'm very hyped. I have a few icebreaker questions for you before we dive into the formal intro. So I'm going to read the beginning of a sentence and I'd love for you to complete it. If I weren't an engineer, I would be...
I'd be an artist.
Okay, it fits into the intro profile that we had. The best thing to happen to architecture in the last 10 years is...
Moving into 3D more.
Okay, and now I'd love to hear from you. Maybe you can give our listeners an introduction, who you are, and also what you've been up to.
Sure. So my name is Katherine Chimenes, as you said. I'm a structural engineer with Price & Myers, and I've been in London for 14 years now. I'm currently very excited because one of the projects that I've been working on for 3 years is happening on site. So this is all very exciting. We're doing some pre-stressing of rods tomorrow.
Nice.
And I know your first guest works for Renzo, and this is an artwork by Pay White that's going to go on a Renzo building in Paddington, so that's quite fun.
Okay.
All the worlds meet. I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you.
As you know, the point of this podcast is to shed light on breaking free in AEC, as we say. And I'm going to start with focusing on your career path, because I think you have a very interesting experience and lots of projects that you've worked on. So some people say that career pivots are the points of our greatest growth and biggest challenges. And you are an expert in pivoting. You went from coding to structural engineering, and you didn't skip a beat, right? So how was this shift for you behind the curtains? Tell us everything.
So when I was very young, before I left Paris, I was determined to be into tech. Interestingly enough, I think back in the day, so I finished high school, so I did my bac when I was 17, so in 2010. And in France then, you don't really learn how to code at high school level. So there's very little exposure to programming. I think I did some Flash animations for fun for a project. We tried to build a website for landmines, actually. It's a very dark, heavy topic for kids. But that was when I was like dabbling in like HTML and using stuff like Dreamweaver or something. I can't remember. It's like a part of like that suite of tools that Flash had to make websites. And so that was the old times, but I really got into it. And I also self-taught Photoshop and was just really into math sciences, but I was also really into arts and music and literature. So I pursued that. But then when I applied to university, I decided to go for computer science at Imperial because it's very hard to get into. And I love a good challenge, and I like the notion of being able to create websites and apps and seeing what I could create and impact on the world with those skill sets. But I think what I didn't realize was how different it would be in reality. I think that happens quite often. So I joined a course where a lot of people already had a head start. I remember very clearly some kids who worked for Microsoft since they were 15. They had already launched apps, and it was very impressive. But then it was one of those environments where the course was quite well known. So I got given an opportunity to work for a hedge fund, which I didn't apply to, as a software developer for a summer. And I think at that point, it really just hit the nail on the coffin and made me realize I find this environment not really creative enough for me. It was all very abstract, a bit too abstract for me. I wanted to do something more tangible. And I met people during my time at Imperial who were doing civil engineering, and I met people who became structural engineers and learned more about it. And I was like, that's really cool. You get to have an impact on the built environment and really make things that you can touch, you can experience, you can walk in. And that was fascinating. So I got curious and I decided to leave and changed direction. And I did civil engineering at UCL, did an MEng, and I also got an opportunity to intern at Arup, where I ran to someone called Paul Jeffries from Ramble, who showed me the ropes of Grasshopper and Rhino.
There you go.
There you go. And they knew about my coding experience, and I think very luckily I got amazing mentors then. And they saw the opportunities for me to bridge the gap between my past life and my new area of expertise.
So interesting. And also, I love the story of like you meeting people during your degree at Imperial that got you into civil engineering. And then, you know, the entire story builds up quite well for you. And what I also found is that you jumped into the AEC industry after your master's.
Yes.
But there's also an experience at Nike. And I just want to talk about this because I thought it was interesting to see, you know, a bunch of like AEC companies on your LinkedIn profile and then Nike.
Yeah.
So if you can just tell us what happened there. I'm just
okay.
very curious.
So I'm really into sports. I used to really be into running and HIIT. And I remember doing some Nike event that was open to everyone. We're like doing something in Westfields where I just like did a huge like 200 people wide HIIT workout. And they picked 5 people to like give free shoes to. I think back in the days, I had no idea about like the right kit to wear, but I was really sporty. I think that for that training session, I wasn't wearing sports shoes, I was wearing sneakers, but I didn't know the difference then. But I was really like, you know, I was doing burpees like my life depended on it. And they gave me some stuff, and I think they saw an energy in me and a sort of like motivation. And very rapidly, actually, so that was before influencers. And they supported me by trying to see what my take was on their products. And they invited me for focus groups. And I was doing that while I was studying. It was quite interesting because there are some interesting patterns that you could actually spot. Now, reflecting about it, because I don't really talk about my experience with the Nike that much anymore, but they have such a strong focus on the user. I remember in one of the focus groups that I did, some people were asked questions about their running leggings, and they gave answers that were very positive, and they didn't give any negative answers, because I think they knew they were getting free stuff in exchange, and I think that created a bias in their answers. I wonder how much of what people say in a public forum, or when they know that it's been listened to by people who are creating, you know, a product or that they like, or collaborators, whether, you know, they are architects you work with or clients you work with. How much of your answers are there to please the audience, and how many people actually dare to
say the truth?
What was also interesting, and I think we can also sort of think about how other industries work and how you translate those principles into realm of AEC. So they drive this really strong approach of organizing focus groups, trying to find people in the general audience to get their opinions. For example, I remember as well, so when you're a woman, and you do sports, if you're a woman listening, you would know that sports bras are extremely tight. They can be very uncomfortable. And so I actually said to them, why don't you find a way to design a clasp at the back so that you can open it, but that it's designed so that it doesn't rub against the skin. And guess what? They did it. You know, it came on the market a few months later. I'm not saying like I'm taking full credit for it.
Maybe you drove that
but maybe because like these focus groups are there.
Because
there's a strong desire to hear
the customer's
point of view. And to be honest with you, as a structural engineer, I have very rarely been asked, what do you want in our software?
This is so interesting, and also beautiful transition to my next question. I wanted to ask you, I mean, from this experience at Nike, which sounds like you clearly drove a lot of their product innovations. I'm glad to hear that.
I doubt it.
What were your key learnings that you maybe applied to your current role now at Price and Myers?
So, interestingly enough, that focus on customers and user experience is also something that I've encountered in tech. So, when I was a software developer, we do so much research on how is a user experiencing, interacting with what you're developing for them. And I've actually learned as well the hard way. So, I tried to get people in the AEC. So, when I worked at Arab, I was trying to get some good points and aspects of the tech side of things, and to try and get structural engineers or other engineers in AEC to adopt it. Adopt those tools. One of them was version controlling. So version control with tools like Git. But the barrier of entry is really hard, firstly. Secondly, the tool isn't meant to be used with files like Excel or scripts. So there was a gap in two ways. One, there was a gap in a lack of understanding of the user from my end. So I was trying to get people to pick up a tool that the barrier entry was too high. Secondly, the other aspect was that the tool itself wasn't built for the AEC industry. It was built for coders, for coding. So that didn't work too. I think my experience with Nike taught me in a way to maybe indirectly pay more attention to the users, because sometimes the best ideas will come from people who are using the things. That's interesting because it applies to the AEC in many ways, right? It applies in a sense of, okay, I'm building a tool that I might be using directly for my project currently to design, like let's say a beam. And then it also applies to the fact that we as a design team, we're designing a building, let's say, for an end user. Sure, we have a client, but the client is not necessarily the end user, right? Also, I'm issuing information. So I'm producing drawings, I'm producing models, Excel tables, calculations. Who's reading that? Do we ask ourselves that question? Sure, we've been doing this way for decades, but have we actually ever had an honest conversation with someone after issuing our deliverables to say, I'm issuing this to you, you've hopefully read it, what do you think of it? Which parts did you actually enjoy reading or looking at? Maybe we should learn more about the other industries where there's such a heavier focus on the end user. Post-occupancy surveys for buildings. We have all these buildings that are coming out, new builds or refurbs, but how often do we actually talk to the people about their experience once they move in? And I think that's really important because it should have a strong influence as to where we're going. It's not always about the lettable area in your building. Yeah. It should be about human experience, but we're not doing enough, I think, from all sides.
And actually, the first example you mentioned about version control was an internal adoption use case, right? Like
yes.
It's not even an external customer. No. You were convincing your team to use the tool. So I'd love to know, was implementing Speckle a rebellious act for your team, and did they resist to change? How was that experience for you?
So I've been known to try and push new tools.
I figured there was history here.
I've tried pushing Speckle a few times. I even got some colleagues to actually join in on a hackathon with me.
Nice.
A couple of years ago. I think Speckle's always been something that I wanted to try, but I think the same with all the tools that we look at in the AEC, because we're so constrained by time and by budget and by resources on projects because of the way the economic model is built. We don't have that much freedom to explore new things. I think I had to convince myself that Speckle was the right choice first. I know what challenges sometimes I face on projects personally, and I can also see how other people are facing similar hurdles. However, I also know that I'm using tools like Rhino and Grasshopper, and that it's not the case for everyone. When I started using it, I realized instantly about the different use cases that Speckle can have. It came out mostly out of necessity on a project I'm working on. The architects wanted ambitiously to work on a geometrically intricate roof, but they are used to working in 2D. And what I was trying to communicate to them is that having that geometry implies that you have to actually think about the 3D aspects of it, because there are certain detailing aspects that you just can't resolve in 2D because of software barriers. Not everyone has a license for Rhino or Grasshopper or Revit even. Or, some people might be using MicroStation, and Speckle was kind of the answer. So even though they didn't have Rhino, and I could export it in various softwares format for them, but I could just say, hey, this is the model. You can spin around on the web viewer, and you can measure things, you can cut sections through it, and let me know what you think of what I've designed in response to your drawings. Interestingly enough, when the barrier of entry is quite low, people start using something new, they realize, okay, there's an opportunity here for me to actually look at this in 3D when I couldn't do it before, and they buy into it. So very rapidly, they actually ended up getting Rhino as well.
Nice.
But it goes back as well. It ties into a story that I was talking about, trying to get people to use GitLab.
And version control.
Version control.
Yeah.
Because my first attempt when I took on the lesson of, okay, I'm designing for this kind of user, was to think about, okay, I'm going to create a spreadsheet that does version control. So all the engineers know how to use spreadsheets. It's going to reduce the amount of investment, because I'm not, and that's one very important thing actually. I'm not a software developer. I'm not a computational designer. I am fundamentally a structural engineer. I believe that we shouldn't divide those two roles into two separate trajectories. Currently, however, it's quite challenging because over my past few years being a structural engineer, I've never really found an environment where both my skills are being recognized fully. It's really challenging because there's no schema that exists currently in the industry that gives enough recognition and a trajectory for growth for people who are structural engineers with computational skills. There is added value, and there's very, very rapidly a required added value to our profession as a structural engineer to carry out those tasks with computational skills that we just can't get away from. It's still being considered as like a bonus, like an extracurricular skill.
I see.
Oh, great, you know 2 more languages. So it's not really an integral part of your full set of skills. And I think until there is space for that recognition, we're going to lose a lot of talent. So a lot of people are going to depart AEC to go into adjacent industries such as sports, like athletics with Nike, or just pure tech, because there is a more opportunity for growth, it's better paid, and it's a sad thing.
But you're sticking to the industry.
Yes,
so
I am. I don't know why though.
So I was going to say, tell us why, but actually I might have a better question. I'd like to focus on the highlights of your experience working with both Arup and also Price and Myers, right? Okay. So it's 2 leading AEC firms. What would you say, what are the projects that you're most proud of today looking back?
I'm not going to lie. I think during my past 7 years, there's so many moments where I thought I might leave the industry.
But it's been 7 years, and
yes. But I'm still here. I know.
But I'm actually very curious to ask you, what were those thoughts? Like, what triggered? Is it the thing you said about, your skills are not fully being recognized or understood, or are there other reasons why? So
that's definitely one of the reasons why.
Which is a pretty big one, by the way.
Yes. So that's part of the reason why I left Arup as well. Okay. So I'm being a structural engineer primarily. I've always really wanted to be a really good structural engineer. But I have to say, because of my digital skills, I'm basically developing 2 careers in parallel. For some people in certain companies or areas of the AEC, they would see as 2 different roles.
That's right.
Computational designer or structural engineer. And the reality is, I know many people in my time at Arup who have left Arup now, or outside of Arup, who used to be structural engineers, who were doing digital things, and who have transitioned to taking on a 100% computational role. They either helped develop a plugin for Grasshopper. Some people become Grasshopper consultants. The thing is, people naturally try to pigeonhole me as well, because when I was at Arup, not a lot of people had skills in Grasshopper and Rhino. You get asked questions all the time. You end up helping other people on projects. But I need that as well from it's just the same way as senior engineers or associates or directors and partners help more junior engineers. Thing is, I wasn't senior enough to afford that time to mentor others. So I lost out on development and experience in structural engineering. And on top of that, what happens is you start feeling that a gap becomes bigger.
Over time.
So projects I'm most proud of, and I think, it's really will stay high up in that list for me for my whole life, which is the Sagrada Familia Spires. I worked on 4 spires, so the Evangelist spires that completed in November in 2023.
Wow.
But I worked on it as a grad. But I spent 2 years working on that. And we're a very small team. It was me, an associate, and a director working on the spires. I taught that he wasn't an associate then. He was a senior engineer then.
Okay.
And I taught him how to use Grasshopper and Rhino.
Wow.
And, I learned a lot on that project. I pushed the boundaries as to how I could do things, how I could visualize information. I sort of developed the workflow and the way of communicating information and carrying out calculations because I was comfortable in that environment using the software and working in 3D. And we had a chance as well because the Y design team was also using Rhino. So you had mechanical engineers, modeling as services in the Rhino model, as well as the architects, as well as ourselves. So that was quite fascinating. But the reality is when you do that kind of work, you're not gaining the experience of designing a steel beam or designing, a reinforced concrete slab. You're losing out a bit on day-to-day hand calc kind of natural sense of things, and you become an expert in an area that's very niche. But then the gap just becomes bigger. With that gap becoming bigger, it came a time for me where I thought I still want to be a structural engineer, but I've lost the experience. So I need to get myself outside of my comfort zone and be in an environment where I have more autonomy. So I don't have a wired team to hide behind. The scale at Price & Myers allow me to do that. But it's very much a sink or swim situation. You're there with the project and you've got to deliver it. Because of that sort of scale, you have to find your way through it. And you develop an intuition, but you have to have the right environment for it. So you have to have the time and space for it and the right people to support you in doing it. I hope that I don't do that. I hope that, when someone asks me for a question, I don't give them the impression like they're asking a stupid question. I don't want to make them feel like, what? You don't know how to do this? But it's so simple. I just come from the angle that, okay, you're a structural engineer who's never opened Rhino or Grasshopper before. You've never done this before. You've never scripted in Python before. I'll show you how. But I wish that engineers in reverse would have that same mentality for computational designers.
And it also sounds like, because you were telling us you've been through both of those experiments, like in a way, you were able to become an expert in both fields. So it's almost like you're describing that you're lost in picking your battles at times, but you also want to make sure that people around you don't feel the same way. Actually, I would argue that the AEC needs more people like you that have been there and want to make sure others don't go there as well.
Yes.
And reinforce knowledge share and collaboration when they work together. So actually, I'd love to hear from you. Maybe I asked about highlights, but highlights of a project where you saw collaboration come at its best.
So it's in Wales.
Oh,
and that's the one where I brought on board the entire team to use Speckle.
Okay, nice.
And it's just really unlocked collaboration, because what's happened is that all our information is being communicated via Speckle. Someone like me who has that horrible habit of saving as models, at least when we use Speckle, I'm sure that when I open Rhino and it's blank and I want to get a model from the cloud, I can just pick on latest.
Nice.
And I know it's the latest version. But for example, I've communicated connection designs using Speckle. So the architects provide a centerline geometry. I use that for analysis. The fabricator, so steel fabricator, uses it to create the geometry of the steel nodes and the team members and how they're being rotated. And they use that same model to give to the timber fabricator to then cut the timbers and know where they go and put the references. It just becomes all very smooth. And at the same time, the client has a rendered model that is, they can spin around on their phone. So that's it's just very, very smooth. And I think if we didn't have that, because of the complexity of it, it would just have been a lot harder to go through checking all the drawings, because at one glance, you can just see instantly when there's a clash. For coordination, it's just really, really a lot easier. Yeah.
No, I'm happy to hear that this. I didn't want to push for you to mention Speckle, but you did.
No,
so
but it's
this was a great example.
I think a lot of people are really excited by it. Even external parties, and even now it's for example, a partner in a firm doesn't necessarily want to open Revit and wait for 20 minutes for the model to open, and then try and find the right view, and it's just quite clunky, and it's just hard to see everything in one place visually in 3D just by looking at it overlaid. It's just so much faster and more natural than to have to carry out the exercise of loading up different software and models, making sure you're looking at the right latest version, all this kind of stuff. So by showing how to use Speckle, you can just have an AEC model from the architects or our technicians, and then you can just put it on the viewer and just spin around, and you can take great screenshots from it. What's really good about it is the low barrier of entry. What I'm really, really struggling in our industry is that I'm dealing with a lot of very, very clunky software. I mean, even Revit, and there's such a monopoly. These software companies don't have any skin in the game, and especially for structural engineering, where if your software is not working properly, if it's bugged and it's a calculation error, you are at risk of causing harm to people, and that's really scary. But the thing is, if something happens because of a bug or an error in a software, the software company, they don't have any responsibility legally because of all their T's and C's. I don't think it's right. They don't have any skin in the game.
Yeah.
And they don't feel like there is a desire or necessity to improve it. Law has to catch up with tech. And I'm talking about really basic tech. I'm not talking about AI. I'm talking about just
foundation.
Exactly. Things that have been around for over a decade.
Yeah. So it's interesting you're touching on the huge challenges that the AEC industry is facing. And from everything you've been sharing, you seem like someone who doesn't spend too much time stuck on something or in one place. But the AEC industry often seems a bit stuck, right? And have you ever experienced a time when you went against the AEC status quo?
I feel I do it all the time.
Yeah, there you go. I'm sure you have many stories. Just pick one.
I've fought really hard to try and make myself do things I'm uncomfortable with. So when I was at Arab, I fell into a pattern of falling back on digital tools. Because I knew it was something I was really good at. I've realized very rapidly that to push back, I need to understand the user better. So I need to understand how they think, and I need to shift my way of tackling engineering. So forcing myself to do things by hand, learning how to sketch things on a piece of paper, do rapid numbers, to then say, okay, I speak your language now. I know what you're struggling with, and then perhaps I can show you how we could maybe do things slightly differently. What I was able to achieve on my project, the team project, where I got people on board to use a tool like Speckle, even though they weren't scripters, didn't use any 3D software. You have to learn how to speak their language. There is always a right time and right project for using certain tools, but it's helping people to use their existing knowledge to form that judgment and how to understand with empathy their perspective. Going back to the question of user research. Right.
I was actually going to say that because it's funny, I asked you that question, which was kind of off track, but actually it's been coming back, and in everything that you're saying about think of your users first and think of their approach to their own work. And the way you're describing it, it sounds like you're not afraid to putting yourself in that vulnerable spot, but how can you make sure that others do it as well so that you meet in the middle and you break these walls together, right?
Yes.
So one question that we ask all of our guests on this podcast, and I'm very curious to hear your answer to this. What do you think is the elephant in the AEC room?
I think the elephant in the AEC room is that we're not self-aware enough. We're stuck in a bubble where we think that we're a certain way. We don't look outside of our industry. Even just thinking about my experience in tech and having a strong network of people in tech, there is so much to gain from how such a fast-moving, younger industry is doing things. Sometimes the status quo and how we do things how we have been doing things for a very, very long time, it can be a right way, but there might be other right ways. And it's a matter, firstly, of being able to recognize, okay, we're doing this, but maybe we're not the best at doing this. And there's a lot of noise in our industry. You hear so much noise now about AI and machine learning.
Right.
You can't go to a talk or to a conference
Without hearing
it. But what do people actually know about it? I'm talking about really fundamental things like a shift in culture about knowledge. I'm trying to tackle it from a different angle. Digital transformation doesn't necessarily mean let's all start using AI now. Like how? Right? Who's going to do it? You don't even have and it just opens up so many issues in our industry. The funding, the model of funding, the costs, the budgets are being constantly cut on projects. The margins that we are working to are competitively being reduced in structural engineering, but also in architecture and other design team parties, because there is less money, so there's less room for innovation. Even if you have something clever in mind, you just strip it back and say, okay, let's fall back on a safer option. That has a larger repercussion as well, because it means that everything is tied around the model of a project. So we work so hard to deliver the project, but we're losing out on the accumulation of the knowledge. Some companies, a lot of companies in the AEC, even very large, prevalent ones, for example, don't have like a set template for a type of calculation for a very simple element that is occurring in every structure. And also a big one as well is because of all that sort of like squeezing in the reduction of costs and like the pressure people have on delivering projects faster, cheaper, more efficiently. We lose sight of the passion of younger generations. It's not necessarily the salary that drives people to turn up at work. It's something else. What is it? Let's ask ourselves. Some buildings or structures that I've worked on don't have my company's name on it. Don't have my personal name on it, like, God forbids. There's an issue there. It's not about cost. It's about feeling like you're doing something that matters.
Your impact.
Your
right.
impact.
It's interesting that you put it this way, because also earlier you said we're risking losing talent in the industry, and it sounds like this is all linking back together. If I may put it in one sentence, the biggest challenge that you're describing is that the AEC industry isn't doing the right thing to keep the right people, to keep that innovation going and lead towards a more open and creative industry, right? Like, as I said in the beginning, the point of the podcast is to kind of shed light on individuals who are breaking free in AEC. And so breaking free in AEC can be interpreted in a very subjective way. So I'd like to know what does it mean? What does breaking free in AEC mean to you, and how should we achieve it?
I think to break free, you need to understand what things matter. Without understanding the things that matter, you can't break free. Does that make sense? We're stuck in a pattern. If we don't recognize that, if we don't know why we're stuck in it, and what are the things that need to be retained, and what are the things that we can shed, we can't move forward. We can't break free. And I think there needs to be a point where we can cut through the noise. I know architects who don't know how their buildings or structures work structurally. They don't care enough to even understand how their buildings work. They just leave it to the structural engineer to solve it. If you don't care enough, you can't break free. And once we have a better understanding of that, and then also understanding why does the client or the architect want to create this?
Well, look, I hope you mentioned people should listen more. I hope they will listen to this podcast to learn from you. And Katherine, honestly, thank you so much for everything. It was great having this conversation with you, and I can't wait to share it.